All right, welcome back, everybody. I am going to be introducing our next speaker, Penelope J. Corfield, a distinguished historian based in London who specializes in 18th century social history, urban history, electoral history, and any number of other things. Her most recent book, which I can personally recommend, The Georgians, the Deeds and Misdeeds of 18th Century Britain, which was published by Yale in 2022. I bought it for myself as a Christmas present, and it's a great read. She also has one that I'm very much looking forward to, just been published, I guess, yes, on the egalitarian handshake. It's just been published in the journal Urban History this past May. But Penny has a wonderful ability to zero into small things like a handshake, but also to deal with huge kind of big patterns in history. And her forthcoming book, which is December this year, it says here, is entitled Time Space. We are all in it together. So, but in fact, zeroing in on Norwich and Norwich radicalism this morning.
Welcome afar and near. We're talking about the impact of the great city of Norwich. And I thought I'd like to start with this, my introductory section, this imaginative reconstruction of the city, as you can see, with the late medieval walls, the castle and the cathedral. Now you can imagine within that, the medieval city, and by the 18th century, a lot of that has been rebuilt in 18th century style and is also spilling well out around the walls. But these were very impressive walls, large, bulky, and the gates were a brick, but the walls were black flintstone, knapped, and they glittered in the sunlight. It was a quite extraordinary sight. And if you have a look at some of the medieval churches, some of them have black flintstone frontages, and you'll see how impressive they were. Now, in the 18th century, by the mid and late 18th century, the walls were in a bit of decay and were beginning to fall down, and eventually most of them, there are a few tiny areas left, but what a tourist opportunity the city missed by not saving them. It would have been sensational. You know, think what York and Chester do with their walls. Norwich had a finer, more dramatic set. But anyway, I'm talking about the punchiness, the identification of Norwich. It was a very, very distinctive place. And for many centuries, it was the second city in England and Wales outside London. And it was, in effect, as I define it, it was the Manchester before Manchester. That is to say, it was one of the cities whose opinions, thoughts, and actions most concerned the central government. And one of the reasons, Norwich was a great textile centre. Now, we're not talking about that in detail now, but I thought you'd like to see the famous Norwich stuffs. They're made, in fact, in Norwich and in a about 20 miles circle all around Norwich. It's a hub of a manufacturing region, which is one of the reasons why the communications between Norwich and its environs are so strong. But here, that is in the middle is a pattern book showing the variety of coloured patterns they made. To the right is a gentleman's suit. That is an authentic 18th century suit of the plain worsted. And to the left, as you're looking at it, an ornate woman's dress, which had a sheen on it. They could do very exciting things with hot pressing, it was called, on the woolen fabrics, so that it shone, so that it's a sort of middle-income satin. And these were tremendously important across the 18th century, and Norwich had a huge export trade as well, which we'll come on to. And gentlemen's clothing, women's clothing, children's clothing, and soft furnishings from these impressive fabrics. And another reason why Norwich was so important, and here it did differ from Manchester before parliamentary reform in the 1830s. Norwich also was a long-standing parliamentary borough electing 2 seats, and it had an exceptionally large freeman franchise. I do mean man, of course, there's not a female franchise, but it's an exceptionally large franchise. And in the 18th century elections, as I'm sure you know, a lot of them were pocket boroughs, which the reformers worked hard to abolish in due course, and they did. So that when these elections happened, the big constituencies that were taken to represent public opinion were Norwich, Bristol, and the city of Westminster, the 3 largest constituencies. So Norwich was really on the map, economically, politically, and that is a Hogarth satire, an affectionate satire of voting in the Oxfordshire by-election in 1750s. And there you can see he's slightly satirizing the halt and the lame and the blind are all coming up to vote, but the implication is clear that the franchise is spreading in the large constituencies a long way down the social spectrum. So many of the weavers we're coming on to be talking about are voters in this period. And again, in this period before the 1872 reform, voting is open. So you stand up to be counted. You walk up to an open booth and you call out your name, your qualification as a freeman, and your vote. It's very impressive. And of course, it does tell us, historians, a lot about the electoral system. And Norwich was also a centre of religious dissent, and it was noted for its feisty inhabitants. And here I'm giving you a quote from the young and shy William Godwin. He changed his mind later on. He became quite affectionate towards many of the city's residents, but his first alarmed report was to report on the odiousness of the Norwichers, by which he meant their feistiness and their argumentative nature. And Norwich was a city with impact. It was noted for people of firm and decisive opinion. Obviously, not everyone, because that social life is more complex than that. But that was the impression the city gave. But I do apologize here. I have got a lovely 18th century satire of a man with a long nose and a finger pointed haranguing people, but I couldn't find it. So that's not from the 18th century, I'm sure you all realize, but I thought I'd put it in to show a big city with a long, lively urban tradition, multiple contacts overseas through its trading life, religious dissent, political independence. Broadly, they were supporting the Whigs, but often sending the Whig government firm instructions of what they wanted to assist their industry. All this made a very important and decisive city well before we get to the 1790s. But now my next section is to talk about what we would later call the working class input into radicalism in the 1790s. And this, in the long run, this is very, very important. Now, the Norwich weavers were very numerous. They were by far the largest sector of the workforce, and many of them were literate. We know literacy levels are spreading well down the social scale in the 18th century, and Norwich has high literacy rates, as one would expect from a dissenting city. Dissenters are particularly keen on getting people to read so they can read the Bible. But guess what? Once they can read the Bible, they can also read Tom Paine on the rights of man. So there's no limit to literacy. And again, that's another Hogarth print. I just put that in again for interest. It's very difficult to know what the interior of a weaver's weaving loft was like, but that is a satire of one. It's the industrious and the idle apprentice. But have a look at both of them. The industrious one has pinned up tracts behind him, and the idle apprentice, who's falling asleep and let his shuttle fall, has above him, if you probably can't see there in detail, but it's an extract from Moll Flanders, a novel. So they're reading all sorts of things, and there's a book on the front right as well. So they're immersed, and this again is important. It's not that all weavers were equally literate, but enough were literate, sizable numbers, that they could pass on information and debate these things in their clubs and societies and all the rest. So, and as I said, many of these were voters. And in the 1790s, there are two elections when they're supporting the radical candidates. In 1796, a big push to support the Quaker, note the Quaker candidate, Bartlett Gurney, from the banking family, but there's a strong connection between radicalism and radical dissent. And these workers are organized in political clubs. Now, this is one of the most tantalizing areas. We don't know the number of these clubs, and we don't know how many are attended or what is going on. But inspired by the findings of news sources, we must keep looking, because you never know what you're going to find. But again, this is a satire of the political clubs. And hang on, I'm just checking my documentation. Yep. It's a satire again from the 1790s, a hostile satire. But what is showing is, in fact, a set of workers gathered together. They're in a cellar by candlelight, and they're made to look a bit like troglodytes. You know, it's a hostile satire. But actually, it's a group of workers sitting, chatting about the political news. Somebody is reading to them, and they're debating. And we know that there were lots of clubs like this across Norwich. And here is one fragmentary but very tantalizing bit of evidence for us from Fanny Burney, the novelist. The artist clubs were networked across Norfolk and also linked to the London clubs. Now, it's very hard to know how systematic anything of this was, but let's take her quote first. That's her in her fine hat. She says, "I was truly amazed," and the first impression was, of course, amazement, "and half alarmed," so she wasn't terrified, but half alarmed, "to find Norfolk filled with little revolutionary societies, which transmit their notions, to the large committee at Norwich, which communicates the whole to the reformers of London." Now, as I say, we don't know how many such clubs there were. We know there were plenty of these political clubs in Norwich. It's highly likely that there were quite a number, particularly in some of the more nucleated settlements like Diss or Thetford or other, and it's perfectly logical that such clubs would communicate. Weavers were constantly coming into Norwich. They collect the combed wool to make these stylish garments. They collect it from the Norwich wool combers. They go out, they bring it back to the Norwich merchants who are sending it to markets in London and overseas. So there are these networks, but how systematic, we really don't know. And again, how systematic were the communications between Norwich and London, we don't know, but there certainly was some communication. And we have evidence from Isaac Saint, 1794, again, when being quizzed by a hostile government, but the radical artisans were in touch with Norwich's radical intelligentsia, who we've been hearing about, and I want to say more about them. And they the radical artisans shared in the 1790s both economic and political objections to Britain's war against revolutionary France. One of the major common bonds for them was opposition to the war, because the war was absolutely having a devastating effect on the Norwich industry, but also politically, because they were admiring at least the early days of the French Revolution. They were a bit more ambiguous and ambivalent after the Terror, but admiring the early days, so that they were political reformers and economic reformers. And this, again, excuse the 18th century language, but it is, of course, from the era. At the Bell, there was a society consisting of people of consequence that used to purchase books, which they gave away to the inferior societies. And that's the evidence of one of the activists. Now, that is, of course, language of the day, so that's of a social hierarchy. But interestingly, they're talking about contacts between the radical intelligentsia and the radical workers. And the Saint goes on to mention some of the books that are passed on, that they're buying and passing on. Tom Paine's Rights of Man is one of the major ones in the list he gives. So we know, we have hints of these sorts of networks, and they're probably not as organized and systematic as as all that, and they wax and wane. It depends on local activism and all sorts of things, and especially after the clampdown, on which we're going to hear in the next talk, then of course this all tends to fade away. But there are these networks. So the radical artisans are by no means operating in isolation. And then at the same time in Norwich, we have what we would later call a radical intelligentsia. And they were seeking to unite workers by hand and by brain. I'm sure you, well, I hope you recognize that phrase. It's from the early days of the Labour Party, seeking to unite the workers by hand and by brain. So it's 100 years before the British Labour Party, but the radicals in Norwich are trying to develop cross-class common political organizations, political objectives, and political momentum. And here is a statement from the Norwich Revolution Society to the London Corresponding Society. It dates from 1792. Surely the interests of the industrious, from the richest merchant to the poorest mechanic, are in every community the same? Question mark. Well, note, he says the industrious. It's the equivalent of the workers. So the merchants are working at one level, the mechanics at another, but aren't their interests the same? And when it came, for example, to opposing the war with France, they were absolutely the same. But of course, it isn't always the case. When there's a wage dispute or a dispute over working conditions, then they're often at odds. But nonetheless, this is what the radicals in the early 1790s are trying to stress, the community of interest. So both looking at organization and aims, sharing literature, sharing ideas, and then I just thought I'd add to the points we've already had about who are these radical intelligentsia. They're men and women, come on to the women later, especially from Norwich professional families. And Norwich, of course, as well as being a great commercial and manufacturing centre, has a very, very strong professional sector because it is a large populous society with plentiful job opportunities for this group. So among the contributors to the Radical Journal, which we're coming on to, Charles Marsh. Oh, sorry, the first digit. I've given him an impossible. Oh, no, sorry, it's a question mark. It's my own eyes. It's a question. His birth, we think, 1774. So you can work out from the birth dates. These are young activists in the 1790s. He becomes a barrister. He's the son of a Norwich manufacturer. So the professional and manufacturing sectors are interlinked. Thomas Starling Norgate, a journalist, son of a Norwich surgeon. Edward Rigby, already mentioned, a physician. William Taylor, again already mentioned, an essayist and poet, son of a Norwich merchant. So they're immersed in this society, and they are a lively, debating, excited group. And the most impressive thing they do in 1794 to 5, they produce a fortnightly magazine, the Cabinet, by a Society of Gentlemen. It only runs for a restricted time, but it's a very impressive publication. And it includes poems, essays, a very detailed history of the war against France, polemics against corruption, and it advocated the frequent parliaments and manhood suffrage. And one of them, Norgate, wrote a pioneering essay in favor of female suffrage. So they're dealing with radical ideas from the point of view of society as a whole. Quite possibly, many of them would have agreed with Norgate that women ultimately should have the vote. But in the 1790s, it was really tricky enough to be advocating universal franchise for men, and probably some of them thought it's not worth going over the top for women as well. We're going to have a hard struggle to get votes for men, and of course they didn't then, but they were prefiguring things that were to happen. They were prefiguring. And oh yes, just one point on most of the rest. You would have guessed, what would be in a radical magazine: the poems, the essays, the polemics, etc., etc. The history of the war against France shows it's a bit like updated news for people, because they were following the war and the implications, which closed. Though Britain wasn't at war with every single country on the European mainland, but all the ports were closed because the shipping lines were all disrupted. So Norwich over time had been moving increasingly into export markets. So it was having a very deleterious effect on the economy. And what they're doing is seeking to create and disseminate a radical and egalitarian culture. When I say egalitarian, that means citizens treating each other equally, no matter what their background is. It doesn't mean giving everybody the same income and removing all social hierarchy. And actually, even societies trying to introduce equality have found it very difficult to remove, differences of age, expenditure, all the rest. People behaved, even if you give everybody the same amount of money at the start of the week, they'll have a different amount left by the end. But anyway, it's egalitarian sharing. And among the young radicals at this time, they're not the only group adopting this, but they are ones who adopt the handshake. So we know Wordsworth and Coleridge, for example, would shake hands. They wouldn't do the old style, take your hat off and bow. They would shake hands. And in fact, there is a later reference in a Coleridge letter, because by the early 19th century, they've fallen out over politics with Thelwall. And Coleridge writes quite bitterly, the gulf between us is too great to bridge in our ideas, and I couldn't shake hands with him. So it really matters. And these young radicals are shaking hands and trying to introduce, as I say, an egalitarian, a sharing culture in which the industrious all work together on an equal basis. So that is the intellectual context. I must keep an eye on that. Time is racing by, but it's worth mentioning and indeed stressing the participation of women among the Norwich intelligentsia and their role. Well, I was trying to think of how to describe it, but they had a certain sort of social fluency and ease and civilized discourse. That's perhaps not quite the right phrase, but that many people commented that meetings purely with men, and many of these meetings were male only, could become a bit rumbustious. And so I've put up a satire on the left, which is a gentleman's club, but when they're all completely sozzled and one of them is falling over in front just to prove how sozzled he is. But at the same time, the other is, again, a caricature, and that's a caricature of the Blue Stockings meeting, which is an all-women's meeting. And the women are fighting and like cats and tearing each other's hair. I mean, again, it's a hostile caricature. But the point is, men and women together managed to have these rational discourses on a happy, equal, free, and relaxed social ambiance. And that was one of the things that people commented about, the atmosphere in Norwich, that women were all part of this, not sort of locked away separate. And so the couple at the bottom, I tried to find a couple sort of in serious, an 18th century picture, not a caricature of a couple in serious discourse. That's the one at the bottom. In the middle, that's the best I could find. Most of the ones of couples together are courting couples with somebody. Rowlandson is very good at couples together gazing amorously. That's not quite what I meant, though. It's a wonderful topic. How many love affairs were there among this young radical intelligentsia? We don't know, but a lot of them were young and keen and ardent. It's quite possible, but we don't know that. And just to give you some of the names, we've heard of the Plumtree sisters, Anne and Annabella, always known as Belle. They were both writers and translators in their own right, taken seriously in their own right. And they were both daughters of a successful Anglican clergyman coming from a different sector of the professional sector of society. And of course, Amelia Opie Alderson in her maiden name, Amelia Opie. Also, you can see young and ardent in the 1790s, novelist, staunch abolitionist against the trade in enslaved Africans, the daughter of a Norwich physician. And there was, I'm sorry, I know we have a speaker on Amelia later on. Sorry if I'm stealing the thunder. There is a feminist first in Norwich in the 1790s, but with no public fanfare. So it's not widely known. Now, the picture, again, is from the 2008 film, The Duchess. And anachronistically, it shows the Duchess addressing a crowd, an election crowd, in al fresco in the 1780s. And when I saw that film as a historian, I wanted to jump up and say, everybody, no, that's wrong. Because a lot of the film was based on careful historical evidence. But no, as far as we know, no non-royal woman is recorded as speaking in public before 1896 in this country, except for Amelia Opie in Norwich in 1796. And we have one witness. She never made anything of this, but she stood at an election meeting and spoke in favor of Bartlett Gurney, the radical candidate. That's a very daring thing for a woman to do in that context, but it shows the ease and confidence with which women were accepted in radical circles at this time. She never made anything of this, but we have an eyewitness account from Sarah Fielding, who was the sister of the novelist Henry Fielding, and she was quite a radical figure in her youth, but she was actually rather tutting in her letters, saying, oh, really, I'm not expecting to see this. A woman. That woman is a woman. So I've got to keep my eye on my time. Just a very few big points. That the Norwich Radicalism is really important historically for its creativity and its ambition. It's trying to set up the equivalent of how democratic politics would work long before a working democracy has been established. And in fact, in the 20th century, it takes a lot of effort to get that to happen. And the emblem in the cabinet, it's very poorly etched. I must get a better reproduction of it, so I'm just describing it here. But the emblem, interestingly, has a Staff of Liberty. It has the French bonnet rouge on the end of the Staff of Liberty to indicate support for the early stages of the French Revolution. As I say, after the Terror, they were less certain. And it's set against a branch of myrtle, symbolizing peace. So it's peace, liberty, and the franchise is what they're pressing for. And they're trying to invent democracy before a democratic system. Now, for them, the paradox, it was enough to alarm conservative opinion, mightily alarm conservative opinion, and especially with radical activism coming from a city as large and significant as Norwich. So in some ways, this is the radical dilemma. You make a big fuss, you push, but you may produce a greater counter reaction, as we're going to hear. So the Norwich experiment, lively, creative, brilliant as it was not strong enough to succeed. It's enough to alarm, but not strong enough to succeed. The cabinet ended in 1795. They ended it voluntarily, but clearly reacting to the government crackdown. And they were answered by the Anti-Jacobin in 1797, a magazine, a counter magazine from the right-wing intelligence. It's got some very brilliant writers in it, but very interesting. It's part of the government clampdown, but they're using the same technique of a magazine of something written that can be circulated and passed around. And as I said, if the radical artisans, and later would be called workers, don't have, if they're not all literate, there are enough literate ones among them to read it out. And one of the things we do know in this period, it was really quite common for people in pubs and clubs to read things aloud. It wasn't thought of as baby spoon feeding, but just a natural way of communicating. So Norwich is a portent, the Norwich Radicalism. It's an urban hub of cross-class radical activism. There had been, there were artisan movements, there were trade unions, there were all sorts of activities going on, but this is a specific attempt at cross-class activism. And it's also involving both men and women. So it's cross-class and cross-gender. Now, Norwich's own fortunes changed considerably over the next centuries. In fact, with the troubles of its textile industry and eventually the collapse of the industry, and which moved and was mechanized and moved to Yorkshire, the status of Norwich as the Manchester of its day did change, although of course it remains a major regional centre, as it still does. But its message from the 1790s clearly did not end. And the message was simply, there is a radical alternative. And that's what Norwich showed. It was the hub of the radical alternative. I mean, again, there are very fascinating, like the Birmingham Lunar Society is a very fascinating club of the radical intelligentsia, but it's not trying to work with radical workers, which the Norwich intelligentsia and the workers, vice versa, you know, mutually were trying to work together to create a cross-class movement. And so, as a final antidote to Godwin on the odiousness of the Norwichers, I'm ending with Southey's verdict in 1801. Norwich is a place of which all remembrance is pleasurable. Now, I don't think Thelwall would have said quite that, because he did come across some opposition. But nonetheless, if you look at Thelwall's writings in general, his references to Norwich are always complimentary, particularly for the liveliness, vitality, and spiritedness of its population.